The Feldwebel checks his watch. 6:23. The fog sits thick in the valley below Fort Driant, and the morning smells like wet stone and coal smoke from the field kitchen 2 levels down. He has been in this position for 11 days. The Americans probe. They withdraw. They probe again. Their infantry is green. Their tanks bunch up on the approach roads where the 88s can reach them. The fortification walls are 19 feet of reinforced concrete poured by French engineers 40 years ago and improved by German ones since June. A man could grow old waiting for American shells to crack this place open. He lights a cigarette. The observation slit frames a gray nothing. Visibility perhaps 200 meters, and the Americans never attack in fog. Their artillery is loud and wasteful. He has learned their habits. First comes the ranging shot, a single round that kicks dirt somewhere to the left or right. Then the corrections. Then the barrage builds, shell by shell, giving a man time to move, to find cover, to count the intervals and guess the caliber. The Americans telegraph everything. They are rich and careless, and their shells fall like rain on empty ground because they cannot be bothered to aim. At 6:24, the world ends. No ranging shot, no spotter round, no build-up. The concrete floor jumps. His cigarette is gone. He does not remember dropping it. The air is dust and a sound too large to be called sound. He is on his hands and knees and does not remember falling. Something wet runs down his neck. Through the observation slit, he sees nothing but smoke and fire and debris still rising, still hanging, refusing to fall. The barrage lasts 4 seconds, perhaps 5. Then silence so complete his ears ring with it. 60 shells. He will learn the number later, during the interrogation, when an American intelligence officer shows him the fire mission log with something like pride. 60 shells from 6 batteries, fired from 6 different positions, timed to land within the same 2-second window on a target the size of a tennis court. No warning, because there was no registration fire. No buildup, because the Americans had solved a problem the Feldwebel did not know existed. How to make 6 batteries speak as one voice, their rounds converging from different distances at different elevations, arriving together like a fist. The Germans had a word for this. Feuerzauber, fire magic. They used it themselves, on good days, with excellent crews and a great deal of coordination. The Americans did it routinely, in fog, on targets they had never fired at before, using mathematics instead of observation, using radio nets that linked every gun to every forward observer to a fire direction center that could mass 20 battalions on a single grid square in less time than it took a German battery to register. The Feldwebel's battalion surrendered 4 hours later. Not because the fortification was breached, not because the infantry assault succeeded. The concrete held, the walls stood, but the men inside could not make themselves believe they would survive another barrage that came without warning or mercy, without even the simple courtesy of a ranging shot that said, "Here we are, find your hole." This isn't the version of World War II, where American artillery was a sideshow. If you want the history that actually mattered, the systems, the numbers, the reasons, hit subscribe. If you know something about Metz I missed, the comments are open. What broke that German battalion was not American firepower. The Germans understood firepower. What broke them was American precision, arriving at American speed, and the sickening realization that they had never seen it coming because the Americans did not need to aim in the way the Germans understood aiming. The mathematics did the aiming. The radios did the coordination. And by the time the shells arrived, the decision to fire them was already ancient history. At the artillery school in Jüterbog, 40 miles south of Berlin, every German officer learned the same lesson. Artillery has a voice before it has teeth. The first round is the question, where are you? The adjustments are the conversation. Only then does the killing begin. This was not theory. This was 30 years of accumulated evidence drawn from the Western Front, the Eastern Front, Poland, France, North Africa. A battery opens fire. The first shell lands long or short or wide because no map is perfect. No calculation accounts for wind and temperature, and the small variations in powder charge that accumulate across 1,000 rounds. The forward observer watches the burst. He radios a correction. The second shell lands closer, perhaps a third adjustment. Then fire for effect. The full weight of the battery unleashed on a target now properly located. The process takes minutes, sometimes longer. A German soldier in a well-constructed position had time. Not much time, but enough. Time to hear the first round and move. Time to reach the bunker, the trench, the reverse slope. The ranging shot was a courtesy that artillery had been extending to infantry since 1914. You knew death was coming. You could prepare. General der Artillerie, Karl Toholte, commanded Corps Artillery on the Western Front in 1944. After the war, the U.S. Army Historical Division asked him to explain what the American artillery had done to German defensive doctrine. His answer fills 17 pages of a foreign military studies report. The key passage is short. The Americans, he wrote, had solved the problem of predicted fire to a degree the German army never achieved. They could mass fires from multiple battalions on targets their observers had never seen, using calculations alone, with an accuracy that made registration unnecessary. Toholte served 40 years in uniform. He had seen artillery evolve from horse-drawn guns to motorized batteries to rocket projectors. He understood the mathematics of ballistics as well as any officer alive, and he was describing something that should not have worked. Look at what the Americans were asking their guns to do. 6 batteries, 6 different positions scattered across the landscape east of Metz. 6 different distances to the target, the closest perhaps 4,000 yards, the farthest maybe 12,000. 6 different barrel elevations, 6 different flight times, the near shells arcing low and fast, the far shells climbing high and slow. To make 60 rounds land in a 2-second window meant solving 6 separate ballistic equations and timing the fire commands so the last battery fired first and the closest battery fired last, in fog, without being able to see the target, without a single spotting round to confirm the math. The German army could do this. Occasionally, with extensive preparation and excellent communications, and crews who had trained together for months. The process required a coordinated fire plan, built hours in advance. It required precise survey data that took days to collect. It required luck. The Americans did it on request. A forward observer spotted a target. He radioed a grid coordinate to his battalion fire direction center. The FDC computed the solution, checked with adjacent battalions, assigned the mission, and the shells were in the air. Elapsed time from request to impact, often under 3 minutes, sometimes under 2. The German soldier waiting for his ranging shot never heard it, because it never came. The first sound was the last sound. Everything the German artillery schools taught about survival under bombardment assumed a pattern the Americans had abolished. The Feldwebel at Fort Driant had 11 days to learn American habits. He learned the wrong habits. He learned the habits the Americans showed when they were registering guns, adjusting fire, walking shells onto targets the old way. What he never saw, what he could not have seen until it killed him, was what the Americans could do when they stopped being polite about it. The graphical firing table weighed less than a pound. A cardboard slide rule, 18 inches long, printed with curves and scales that condensed several hundred pages of ballistic data into something a lieutenant could carry in his map case. The German army had nothing like it. The British had a version. The Americans mass-produced theirs by the tens of thousands and issued one to every fire direction center in every artillery battalion in the European theater. The device looked simple because the thinking behind it was not. Every gun tube has a personality. Barrel wear changes muzzle velocity. Temperature affects powder burn rate. Humidity changes air density. Wind pushes shells off course. The rotation of the Earth, Coriolis effect, deflects rounds fired north or south. A gun firing the same charge at the same elevation will not hit the same spot twice unless every variable stays constant, and variables never stay constant. Traditional gunnery solved this through registration. Fire around. Observe the error. Correct. Repeat. The graphical firing table solved it through measurement. American survey teams mapped gun positions to within 10 yards. Meteorological sections launched weather balloons every 4 hours and radioed corrections for wind and temperature at every altitude the shells would cross. The GFT combined these inputs with pre-computed ballistic curves to produce firing data that worked the first time. The mathematics were not secret. Any competent artillerist understood the theory. What the Americans built was not a formula, but a system. Standardized procedures and equipment, standardized training that let any FDC anywhere compute any mission the same way. A forward observer in the Hurtgen forest used the same radio procedures as an observer in the Vosges. His call reached an FDC staffed by men who had learned the same techniques at Fort Sill, using the same plotting boards, the same slide rules, the same firing tables. The solution came out in seconds because every step had been rehearsed until it was reflex. The Germans lost a war here. They did not know they were fighting. American doctrine treated the battalion as the basic fire unit, not the battery. A German battery commander controlled his 4 guns and coordinated with adjacent batteries through his battalion commander. A vertical chain that added time at every link. An American battalion, FDC, controlled all 3 batteries simultaneously. When a mission came in, the FDC computed one solution and transmitted it to all 12 guns at once. The batteries did not need to talk to each other. They did not need to know what the other batteries were doing. They fired on command, and the mathematics guaranteed the shells would converge. Massing fires from multiple battalions required one additional step. The division artillery headquarters maintained a master plot showing every battalion's position. When a mission required more than one battalion, and at Metz most missions did, the Division Fire Direction Center computed separate solutions for each battalion, calculated the flight time from each position to the target, and issued fire commands timed so the shells arrived together. The battalion that was farthest away fired first. The battalion that was closest fired last. The arithmetic was not complicated. An officer with a stopwatch and a firing table could do it in his head. But doing it required knowing exactly where every gun was, what the weather was doing at altitude, how long each shell would spend in the air. The Americans knew all of this. They updated it constantly. They trained their people until the procedures were automatic. The German system was not stupid. It had won campaigns across Europe, but it assumed that coordination took time, that massed fires required planning, that the gap between request and impact could be measured in tens of minutes rather than single minutes. A German officer requesting corps-level artillery support filled out paperwork. An American lieutenant with a radio handset spoke a grid coordinate and waited 90 seconds. The Feldwebel at Fort Driant never saw the graphical firing table. He never visited a fire direction center. He experienced the output, 60 shells landing in a 2-second window, without understanding the input. The system was invisible until it killed you. Why would any commander believe Metz could fall quickly? The city had held before. In 1870, the Prussian army surrounded it with 200,000 men and waited 70 days for starvation to force surrender. The French garrison of 173,000 troops never broke in combat. They broke from hunger. The forts, Driant, Jeanne d'Arc, Verdun, the entire ring of them, had been designed to make direct assault, suicidal and siege the only option. German engineers spent 4 years improving what the French had built. They added concrete. They improved fields of fire. They connected the forts with communication trenches and telephone lines. By September 1944, the Metz fortification complex represented 75 years of continuous military investment by two nations that understood defensive warfare better than anyone alive. The numbers favored the defenders. Fort Driant alone sat on a hill commanding 3 approach routes, its walls 19 feet thick at the weakest points. The main galleries ran underground where no shell could reach them. The garrison had water from internal wells. They had ammunition stocks measured in weeks, food supplies measured in months. An American infantry assault in late September had already failed. The 5th Infantry Division lost over 500 men trying to take Driant by storm, and the fort held. The Americans pulled back. German intelligence read this correctly. The enemy lacked the patience for a proper siege and the firepower to breach the walls. Colonel Georg Richter commanded the Metz garrison sector that included Fort Driant. According to post-war interrogation records, he expected to hold through December at minimum. The autumn rains would turn the approach roads to mud. American armor would bog down. American infantry would bleed against the concrete, and eventually the American generals would decide that bypassing Metz cost less than taking it. This was not wishful thinking. This was doctrine applied to terrain. A fortified position with adequate supplies and determined defenders had always required either starvation or overwhelming force applied over weeks. The Americans had neither the time nor the inclination for either approach. What Richter did not understand, what no German commander on the Moselle line understood, was that the Americans had redefined overwhelming force. The concrete walls that stopped infantry assault and shrugged off conventional bombardment were irrelevant if the men behind them could not function. Starving men cannot fight, exhausted men cannot think, and men who believe every exposed position will draw massed artillery cannot hold a line. The Americans did not need to breach the walls. They needed to make the space behind the walls uninhabitable. The shift happened in October. American artillery commanders stopped trying to destroy the forts and started trying to destroy the garrison's ability to operate. Supply convoys moving at night drew fire within minutes of crossing known road junctions. Communication trenches that connected strong points became killing grounds. Any movement drew observation. Any observation drew shells. The Germans could survive inside the bunkers. They could not survive moving between them, reinforcing threatened sectors. Anything requiring exposure to the sky became lethal. A German officer captured near Fort Königsmacher described the change in a 1945 intelligence debrief. The Americans, he said, seemed to know where every road was, where every path crossed open ground. They fired at movement rather than positions. They fired at timing, shift changes, meal times, the predictable rhythms of garrison life. The shells arrived before a man could reach cover because the Americans were not aiming at where he was. They were aiming at where he would be. Fort Driant fell on December 13, 1944. The walls stood. The concrete held. The garrison surrendered because they could no longer function as a military unit. The Americans had not besieged them. The Americans had simply made the cost of existing unbearable. The artillery came first. According to Third Army records, the guns reached the Moselle before the infantry that would use them. By early November 1944, Patton had massed 11 artillery battalions in support of the Metz operation, over 130 tubes, from 105mm howitzers to the heavy 8-inch guns that could crack concrete. The numbers alone were not unusual. The Germans had faced massed artillery before. What arrived on the Moselle was something different. Third Army's artillery operated as a single organism. Every battalion fire direction center linked to division. Every division linked to corps. Corps Artillery Headquarters maintained a consolidated fire plan that tracked every gun position, every ammunition status, every mission in progress across the entire Lorraine front. A forward observer calling for fire did not need to know, which battalions would answer. He spoke a grid coordinate. The system decided who fired. The shells arrived. General Hobart Gay, Patton's chief of staff, called it the most responsive artillery the American Army had ever fielded. Gay had served in the First World War. He understood what responsive meant in historical terms. The network changed what massed fire could accomplish. Traditional artillery concentration required planning, selecting targets in advance, assigning battalions to specific missions, coordinating timing through telephone calls and written orders. Third Army's FDC network made concentration fluid. A target that appeared at 0730 could receive fire from 3 battalions by 0733. A target that moved could be tracked, the fire adjusted, new solutions computed without starting over. The Germans at Metz faced artillery that behaved less like a weapon and more like weather, omnipresent and completely indifferent to their preparations. Colonel Charles Palmer commanded the 161st Field Artillery Battalion during the Metz operation. His unit fired an average of 800 rounds per day through November. Some days exceeded 1,200. The guns wore out. Barrel replacements arrived by truck from supply depots that had anticipated the consumption rate. American industry had built spare tubes the way German industry had built spare tank engines, as a systemic assumption rather than an emergency measure. Palmer's crews fired until the rifling smoothed, then bolted on fresh barrels and kept firing. The Germans could not replace what they lost. The Americans replaced what they wore out. The Lorraine campaign became an experiment in sustained suppression. American artillery commanders discovered that fortifications could be neutralized without being destroyed. The concrete survived. The men inside stopped functioning. Sleep deprivation alone produced measurable effects within 72 hours. Slower reactions, poor decisions, accumulating mistakes. Harassment missions fell through the night. Random shells landing at unpredictable intervals, just enough to prevent rest. Interdiction missions closed supply routes, destroying trucks the garrison needed to survive. Counter-battery fire silenced German guns before the German gunners could displace. The system fed itself. German weakness created opportunities for more fire, and more fire revealed more weakness. Fort Driant received particular attention. After the failed infantry assault in September, Third Army artillery isolated the position. Supply runs became suicide missions. Reinforcement columns took casualties before reaching the fort's outer wire. The garrison commander reported to Metz headquarters that he could hold the walls but could not hold his men. Morale collapsed faster than concrete. The Americans were not trying to kill everyone inside Driant. They were trying to convince everyone inside Driant that survival required surrender. The battalion that surrendered after a single TOT mission had watched this process unfold across the Moselle line for weeks. They had seen what happened to units that stayed above ground. They had heard the stories from survivors who reached their positions after nightmarish supply runs. They knew, everyone knew by late November, that the American artillery could reach any point on any map at any moment without warning. The 60 shells that landed in 2 seconds were not a surprise in kind. They were a surprise in degree. The Germans expected punishment. They received annihilation. The gap between expectation and reality broke something that walls could not protect. The first TOT missions broke men who had not been hurt. This was the pattern that emerged in November 1944, documented across multiple after-action reports and intelligence summaries from Third Army. German positions that surrendered with minimal physical casualties, their garrisons intact but psychologically shattered. The Americans had discovered something about the human response to coordinated violence that no training manual had predicted. Fort Elange sat 3 miles northeast of Thionville, a minor position in the Metz defensive ring. On November 9th, Third Army Artillery delivered a 12-battalion TOT against the fort's exposed approaches, over 140 rounds, arriving in a window of less than 3 seconds. The ground shook. The air pressure spiked and dropped so fast that men's eardrums bled. The noise was not a sound so much as a physical blow, a compression wave that hit the chest before the ears could process it. Then silence. The guns stopped. The dust settled, and 37 German soldiers walked out with their hands raised before the American infantry had crossed the start line. The Elange prisoners were not wounded. Intelligence officers who debriefed them noted this specifically. Superficial cuts from flying debris, ringing ears, but no serious injuries. The fort's bunkers had done exactly what bunkers were supposed to do. The concrete held. The men inside survived and surrendered anyway. When asked why, several gave variations of the same answer. They had believed they were about to die, and when the dying did not come, they could not imagine enduring the wait again. This response violated everything German doctrine assumed about defensive combat. A soldier in cover, taking fire, draws courage from the knowledge that the fire will eventually shift or stop. He endures, because endurance has a limit. The TOT removed that logic. There was no fire to endure. There was only a single instant of total violence followed by nothing. The mind could not process the transition. Men who had survived Kursk and Normandy, veterans who had learned to function under sustained bombardment, described the experience as qualitatively different from anything in their memories. The duration was too short to adapt, the intensity too high to dismiss. The combination left them waiting for a second blow that never came, and the waiting broke them faster than the shells. American artillery commanders learned to read these responses. A TOT that produced immediate surrender indicated a unit already weakened by exhaustion or isolation. A TOT that produced no surrender indicated a unit with reserves, physical or psychological, that required additional pressure. The distinction mattered for planning. Fort Königsmacher received 3 TOT missions over 4 days before its garrison surrendered. Fort Jutz required only 1. The variables included prior bombardment history, supply status, leadership quality, and something harder to measure: how many times the men inside had already believed they were about to die. The psychological literature calls it learned helplessness, an organism exposed to unpredictable, uncontrollable punishment eventually stops trying to escape. The behavior persists even when escape becomes possible. The American TOT created this condition with industrial efficiency. The German soldier could not predict when the fire would come, could not prevent it, could not even respond. By the time his nervous system registered the threat had already passed. The only choice remaining was whether to wait for it to happen again. Reports from the Metz sector in late November noted a specific phenomenon: German units surrendering to American patrols without contact, emerging from positions that had not been fired on that day. When questioned, they explained that they had heard the bombardments falling on adjacent positions. They had seen what the shells did to the landscape. They had decided that waiting for their turn was worse than captivity. The Americans did not need to hit every position. They needed to hit enough positions that the survivors understood what was coming. 72 guns fired within a window of 0.8 of a second. The mathematics required to achieve this occupied 3 pages of firing data, computed across 6 battalion fire direction centers, each working the same problem from different positions on the Moselle Plain. Shell travel time from Battery A, 41 seconds. Shell travel time from Battery C, 37 seconds. Shell travel time from the core 8-inch howitzers positioned 4 miles further back, 53 seconds. The FDC officers worked backward from the desired moment of impact, computed the firing delay for each tube, transmitted the data by landline to the gun crews. At 06:22, the core battery fired. At 06:26, Battery A fired. At 06:28, Battery C fired. At 06:33, every shell arrived at the same grid coordinate, within the same heartbeat. The German battalion holding that coordinate had been awake for 19 hours. Supply had failed to arrive the previous night. The men had eaten their reserve rations and were waiting for word on whether resupply would attempt the roads again after dark. Some were sleeping in shifts. Others were writing letters they could not mail. One unteroffizier was heating ersatz coffee over a small flame when the world ended. The shells did not whistle. This detail appears in multiple POW interrogations and seems to matter to the men who mentioned it. A shell in flight makes noise, the compression wave preceding it, the rush of displaced air. The brain uses that sound to prepare. A fraction of a second, but enough to tense muscles, close eyes, press against cover. The TOT removed even that. The shells arrived before their own sound. The first sensation was impact. 72 detonations in a space that German doctrine called a company defensive position, perhaps 200 meters by 150 meters. The overpressure wave moved through the position at roughly 340 meters per second, which meant the entire area experienced the blast in less than half a second. Men standing were thrown down. Those lying down were lifted and dropped, eardrums ruptured, lungs bruised from the pressure differential. The noise was not heard so much as felt, a physical force that occupied the entire body simultaneously. Then nothing. The silence afterward was worse. German soldiers who had survived Stalingrad, men who had endured Soviet artillery preparations lasting hours, described this moment as the most disorienting of their military experience. The mind expected continuation. Artillery came in sustained barrages, in patterns that allowed the nervous system to adapt. This was a single blow followed by absolute quiet. The dust hung in the air. The ringing in the ears was the only sound. And somewhere in that silence, each surviving man understood that he had not been killed by something he could not hear coming and could not prevent, and that it could happen again at any moment. The battalion commander emerged from his dugout with blood running from both ears. His adjutant was dead, killed by a fragment that had entered the observation slit at an angle the bunker's designers had not anticipated. 31 men were wounded. 14 were dead. The remaining 163 were physically capable of continuing the defense. They did not continue. The records do not explain the decision in tactical terms because there was no tactical decision. The men simply stopped. They set their weapons aside. They walked toward the American lines with their hands raised. Some were crying. Others were laughing in a way that suggested the laughter was not voluntary. A Feldwebel who had commanded his platoon through 4 years of combat sat down in a shell crater and refused to move until American medics physically carried him away. The battalion had held its position for 11 days against infantry probes and conventional shelling. It surrendered 43 minutes after a single coordinated volley from guns it never saw, fired by men who would never know their names, computed by a system that treated their destruction as a math problem with a correct answer. What does experience teach a man under artillery fire? The German army had 5 years of data on this question by November 1944. Veterans survived because they learned to read the pattern. The first shell lands long, the second lands short, the third splits the difference. You have perhaps 90 seconds between the first impact and the killing bracket, time enough to move, to find better cover, to understand where the observer is watching from, and position yourself in his blind spot. Experience meant pattern recognition. Pattern recognition meant survival. The TOT made experience worthless. A replacement fresh from training, and a Feldwebel with 3 years on the Eastern Front reached the same conclusion at the same moment. They were going to die. The replacement lacked the knowledge to do anything else. The Feldwebel had knowledge that no longer applied. Both men lay in the same crater, waiting for a continuation that never came, their nervous systems locked in identical paralysis. The veteran's advantage, his library of responses built through hundreds of engagements, had become a liability. His brain searched for a pattern that did not exist. The search consumed cognitive resources he needed for other things, like deciding whether to fight or surrender. American interrogators noticed something in the debriefings from Metz that took months to understand. Veteran units broke faster than green units. This contradicted everything the intelligence officers expected. A unit full of Eastern Front survivors should have been harder to crack than a unit of 18-year-old conscripts. The opposite kept happening. The veterans surrendered first, or they stopped functioning first, or they sat in positions doing nothing while the replacements around them continued to fight. The files that document this pattern sit in boxes at the National Archives facility in College Park, Maryland. Record Group 407, 3rd Army G2 interrogation summaries, typed on carbon paper in 1945, transferred to microfilm in 1973. The 2008 digitization was done badly, so several pages are illegible. The observation about veteran units breaking faster appears on page 11 of a summary dated December 2, 1944. The analyst who wrote it did not explain it. He noted it and moved on. The explanation required terminology that did not exist in 1944. Cognitive load theory. The paradox of expertise under novel conditions. A man who has survived by reading patterns will attempt to read patterns even when no pattern exists. The attempt itself becomes the problem. The brain commits resources to analysis. The analysis returns nothing. The resources do not come back. Meanwhile, the body remains in a state of maximum arousal, adrenaline flooding the system, heart rate spiking, muscles locked for action, with no action to take. The combination produces a specific kind of exhaustion, not physical tiredness, something closer to a system crash. Green troops sometimes perform better because they had no expectations to violate. They did not know what artillery was supposed to sound like. They had no internal model of how bombardments progressed. The TOT was terrifying, but it was not more terrifying than they had imagined war would be. Their minds did not waste cycles searching for a pattern. They experienced the impact, waited in fear, and then, when the fear did not kill them, recovered faster than men who had seen everything except this. The German training system could not adapt. New replacements still learn the old patterns at artillery schools in the Reich: how to count seconds between shells, how to estimate range by sound, how to predict the next impact point. The instructors taught what they knew. What they knew no longer applied on the Moselle. Replacements arrived at the front carrying mental models built for a war that had already changed. The Americans had not announced the change. They had simply implemented it, and the Germans discovered the new rules by dying or surrendering. The Feldwebel who sat in the shell crater and refused to move had learned too well. Everything he knew told him to wait for the pattern. The pattern never came. Hauptmann Werner Dietrich raised the white flag himself. According to the after-action report filed by the American company commander who received the surrender, Dietrich walked forward holding a bedsheet tied to a rifle barrel, his uniform correct, his boots polished, the details of a man who had decided to stop fighting but not to stop being an officer. Behind him came his battalion. They walked in no formation. They carried no weapons. Some had their hands raised, others did not bother. The smell reached the American lines before the men did. Cordite, and turned earth, and something sharper underneath. The chemical stink of high explosive mixed with blood and voided bowels. The November air held it close to the ground. One American private, a replacement who had been in theater less than 3 weeks, vomited into his foxhole. His sergeant did not reprimand him. Dietrich stopped 10 meters from the American position and waited. He did not speak. The American lieutenant who approached him noticed the blood dried in both of Dietrich's ears, the slight tremor in his hands, the way his eyes moved constantly, scanning left, right, up, behind, as if expecting the sky to collapse again at any moment. The lieutenant asked in broken German where the rest of the battalion was. Dietrich gestured behind him. This was the rest. 178 men walked into American custody that morning. 14 had been killed in the bombardment. 31 were wounded seriously enough to require stretchers. The remaining 133 were physically capable of continuing to fight. They had rifles in their positions, ammunition in their pouches. They had machine guns with full belts and mortars with rounds stacked beside them. The American infantry had not yet crossed the start line. No assault was imminent. The Germans surrendered into a tactical vacuum. They gave up ground that no one was yet trying to take. The officers could not explain this in terms that made sense to the intelligence debriefers. Dietrich tried. He described ordering his company commanders to reorganize the defense. He described them acknowledging the order and then doing nothing, not refusing. That would have been something, a decision he could have countermanded. They simply stood where they were, staring at him without recognition, as if the words he spoke no longer connected to any action they knew how to take. The NCOs were worse. Men who had kept their platoons together through 4 years of combat sat in shell craters and waited to be told what to do. When told, they did not move. Unit cohesion is a fragile architecture. It depends on shared expectations and on each man trusting that the others will perform their function, the accumulated weight of successful cooperation. The TOT had not killed many men. It had killed the architecture. Each survivor understood, in the silence after the blast, that he was alone. The man beside him could not help. The officer above him could not protect. The system that had kept them functioning as a unit had been revealed as a collective hallucination, useful when the enemy played by recognizable rules, worthless against an enemy who did not. The white flags were improvised, bedsheets, undershirts, a torn medical bandage, someone's pale field jacket liner. The men who carried them did not coordinate. They emerged from positions individually, in small groups, without orders, the same impulse expressing itself across the battalion simultaneously. Dietrich did not command the surrender. He simply walked to the front of a movement that was already happening and gave it the appearance of military formality. The American lieutenant accepted the surrender with appropriate gravity. He did not smile. He did not gloat. He directed the prisoners toward the rear and detailed a squad to escort them. The whole process took less than 20 minutes. The battalion that had held its position for 11 days ceased to exist before breakfast. Dietrich's hands kept shaking for 3 days. The medics at the POW processing station noted it in his intake form. Cause, unknown. Treatment, none available. The interrogator slides another cigarette across the table. December 1945. A processing center in Bavaria. The war has been over for 7 months. The man across the table wears civilian clothes now. A former artillery oberst who spent 3 years on the Eastern Front before his transfer to Army Group G in France. He has answered questions about unit strengths, defensive dispositions, command decisions, standard material. But the American officer keeps returning to the same subject. Tell me about the artillery. The oberst lights the cigarette with hands that no longer shake. He has had time to think. What he says will appear in Foreign Military Studies Report B734, one of hundreds compiled from German officers during the occupation, most of them gathering dust in army archives until historians rediscovered them decades later. The American artillery, the Oberst says, was not the weapon that killed the most men. Soviet artillery killed more. German artillery killed more. The American system killed something else. It killed the moment between knowing and dying. Every soldier needs that moment, not to escape. Escape is often impossible, but to brace, to make peace with what is coming, or to rage against it, or simply to experience the last seconds as a conscious being rather than an object. The TOT removed that moment. Men died without the dignity of knowing they were about to die. The survivors lived with the knowledge that they had been denied even the chance to face their death. This, the Oberst says, is worse than dying. The interrogator writes it down. He does not editorialize. The reports accumulated through 1945 and 1946. Wehrmacht generals, staff officers, field commanders, all of them asked to assess American capabilities, all of them returning to the same theme, not the tanks or the aircraft, the artillery. General der Artillerie Friedrich von Broich called it the most significant American contribution to ground warfare. General Major Rudolf von Gersdorf described it as psychologically devastating in a way no previous weapon had achieved. General Lieutenant Fritz Bayerlein, Rommel's former chief of staff, a man who had faced British artillery in North Africa and Soviet artillery at Kursk, wrote that American fire direction represented a doctrinal revolution. His own service never fully understood until it was too late. The consensus was not about lethality. Every army could deliver lethal fire. The consensus was about information, about what the target knew and when he knew it. The Germans understood finally that they had been defeated by a system that denied them the basic grammar of combat: warning, reaction, consequence. The Americans had collapsed that sequence into a single undifferentiated instant. Warning and consequence arrived together. Reaction became impossible. The architecture of military experience, 5,000 years of soldiers learning to read danger and respond, ceased to function. Dietrich spent 11 months in American custody before his release in October 1945. The processing paperwork notes his cooperation, his correct bearing, his persistent hand tremor that the camp physician attributed to nerve damage of unknown origin. He returned to what remained of his family in the Rhineland. The records do not follow him after that. He was not senior enough to merit continued observation, not implicated in anything that required prosecution. A Hauptmann who lost a battalion walks back into civilian life and becomes a neighbor, an employee, a man who stands in bread lines and rebuilds bombed apartments and does not speak about the war unless asked. The last document with his name is a discharge form stamped at a camp near Stuttgart. Occupation listed as farmer, status listed as fit for labor. The next line asks for forwarding address. The space is blank. Dietrich walked out of the camp gate at 0800 on a Tuesday morning in October, and whatever happened after that happened without the Americans writing it down.